4:15 local time, June 19th, 1944, the Philippine Sea. A low, persistent swell lifts the hull of the USS Fanshawe Bay, CVE-70, a rhythmic rise and fall in the pre-dawn gloom. The air, thick with salt and the metallic tang of aviation fuel, is cool against the skin. On the flag bridge, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague watches the indistinct shapes of his command, Task Group 77.4, emerge from the dark. These are not the Titans of the fleet. They are 14 small escort carriers, colloquially and often derisively known as jeep carriers, steaming in 3 parallel columns. Their silhouettes are squat, their flight decks short, their armor thin. Around them, a screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts slices through the dark water, their wakes glowing with faint phosphorescence. The immediate stakes are monumental. 115 nautical miles to the east, American Marines are fighting and dying on the beaches of Saipan. To the west, moving under the cover of this same darkness, is the full might of the Japanese mobile fleet under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, a force of 9 carriers and 5 battleships sailing with the explicit purpose of annihilating the American amphibious forces and their naval protectors. Sprague's mission is not to fight that fleet. His task is to provide air cover for the invasion, to hunt for submarines, and to stay alive. The state of his forces is one of prepared vulnerability. These slow, unarmored ships were never meant for a fleet action, yet they are now the fragile westernmost shield for the entire Marianas invasion. The first hints of sunlight are beginning to define the horizon, a pale line separating the black water from the indigo sky. The sea is vast, empty, and alive with unseen threats. The day would become legend, but not for these small carriers. It would be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a day of staggering aerial victory for the fast carriers of Task Force 58 far to the east. But here, on the periphery, the work of the escort carriers would be less glorious, yet utterly essential. Their war was a different kind of war, a relentless, grinding effort against the sea itself, against an unseen underwater enemy, and against the tyranny of logistics. They were the background players in a drama of titans, but their performance would quietly shape the outcome of one of the largest naval battles in human history. The very existence of these ships was an exercise in industrial pragmatism, a direct response to the strategic emergencies of a global war. The escort carrier, or CVE, was not born of deliberate naval doctrine that envisioned a new class of warship. It was forged from necessity, an improvisation on a colossal scale. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy faced a critical shortage of aircraft carriers, the capital ship that had just proven its dominance. Building a fleet carrier like the Essex class was a multi-year endeavor involving thousands of skilled workers and vast quantities of specialized steel and machinery. America needed carriers immediately, particularly for the desperate battle against German U-boats in the Atlantic. The solution was found not in naval shipyards but in commercial ones. The shipbuilder Henry J. Kaiser, renowned for his mass production of Liberty ships, proposed a radical concept: convert merchant ship hulls, specifically the S4S-2BB3 tanker design, into small aircraft carriers on the assembly line. The result was the Casablanca class, of which 50 were built in just over a year, an industrial achievement without precedent. The USS Fanshawe Bay was one of these ships. They were rudimentary platforms. Displacing just over 10,000 tons fully loaded, they were less than half the size of an Essex-class carrier. Their top speed was a sluggish 19 knots, barely enough to generate sufficient wind over the deck for launching heavily loaded aircraft in calm seas, and far too slow to keep pace with the 33-knot fleet carriers and their screening cruisers and destroyers. Their protection was minimal, a thin skin of steel that offered little resistance to bombs, torpedoes, or even cruiser-caliber naval gunfire. This vulnerability earned them a litany of dark nicknames from the sailors who served on them: combustible, vulnerable, expendable, Kaiser coffins, or the one-torpedo ships. Yet, for all their limitations, they possessed two invaluable qualities. They were available in large numbers, and they could carry and operate about 28 aircraft, typically a composite squadron of Grumman FM-2 Wildcat fighters and Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers. They were not designed to challenge enemy fleets directly, but to perform the attritional, defensive, and logistical support missions that a fleet at war desperately required. They were the floating airfields that could escort convoys, hunt submarines, and provide close air support for amphibious landings, freeing the powerful and expensive fleet carriers to perform their primary mission, seeking out and destroying the enemy's main naval strength. This division of labor was the core of American naval strategy in the Mid-Pacific War. The jeep carrier was a tool, a utility player, not a star. But in the vast distances of the Pacific, a tool that could project air power anywhere, even from a slow and vulnerable hull, was a weapon of immense strategic value. Task Force 77 was the operational embodiment of this strategic concept, a sprawling command structure responsible for the direct support of the 7th Fleet's amphibious operations under General Douglas MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific. For the Marianas Campaign, however, a component of this force was attached to the 5th Fleet, becoming Task Group 77.4 under Admiral Sprague. This group was further subdivided into 3 smaller units, each a self-contained carrier task unit designated a TAFI. TAFI 1, also known as Task Unit 77.4.1, centered on the carriers USS Sangamon, Suwannee, Chenango, and Santee. These were larger, faster escort carriers converted from oiler hulls, a different class from the Casablanca-class jeeps. Sprague's own group was TAFI 2, or Task Unit 77.4.2, comprising the Casablanca-class carriers USS Fanshawe Bay, Midway, White, Plains, and Kalinan Bay. A third group, TAFI 3, commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's namesake, Rear Admiral Albert Ziggy Sprague, operated nearby with another half-dozen jeep carriers. The composition of each TAFI was a microcosm of naval power projection. The escort carriers provided the aerial striking and defensive power. A close screen of Fletcher-class destroyers like the USS Heermann and Johnston provided a first line of defense against surface and submarine attack, their 5-inch guns and torpedo tubes a potent threat to anything that got too close. A wider outer screen of smaller, more specialized destroyer escorts, vessels like the USS Samuel B. Roberts, provided the primary anti-submarine capability, equipped with sonar, depth charges, and Hedgehog forward-throwing mortars. Their mission profile was clear and demanding. First and foremost was anti-submarine warfare. Japanese naval doctrine relied heavily on submarine forces to attrite an approaching American fleet before the decisive surface engagement. The waters around the Marianas were expected to be infested with Japanese submarines. The CVES Avengers would fly constant patrols, sweeping the ocean with their primitive but effective air-to-surface vessel radar, hunting for periscopes and submerged threats. The second mission was Combat Air Patrol, or CAP. The FM-2 Wildcats, a lighter and more nimble version of the older F-4F model, were to fly protective circles over the task group and the nearby amphibious force, ready to intercept any Japanese reconnaissance planes or bombers that might slip past the main screen of Task Force 58. The final mission was ground support, sending Avengers armed with bombs and rockets to strike Japanese positions on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, helping the Marines on the ground. This was routine, grinding, and dangerous work, carried out far from the anticipated clash of the main fleets. The jeep carriers were the sentinels, the watchmen, the providers of localized security that enabled the larger, more glamorous operation to proceed. They were the logistical and defensive backbone of the invasion, an unglamorous but utterly vital role in the complex machinery of amphibious warfare. The strategic backdrop for this meticulous, localized mission was one of the most anticipated naval confrontations of the war. The American invasion of the Marianas, Operation Forager, was a dagger pointed at the heart of the Japanese Empire. From airfields on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the new B-29 Superfortress bombers could reach the Japanese home islands. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, holding the Marianas was a strategic imperative. The response was a meticulously planned operation named AGO, a plan to lure the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where Japan's new carrier aircraft, flown by pilots who were believed to be well-trained, could annihilate their American counterparts. Admiral Ozawa's first mobile fleet was a powerful force, built around 9 aircraft carriers, including the new armored deck carrier Taiho. These carriers embarked 473 aircraft, a number they hoped would be supplemented by over 300 land-based aircraft from islands like Guam and Rota. The Japanese plan had a critical feature. It relied on the superior range of their aircraft. They planned to launch their strikes from a position 350 to 400 nautical miles away from the American carriers, well outside the range of American naval aircraft. They would strike the American fleet, fly onto land and refuel at the airfields on Guam and Rota, and then potentially strike the Americans again on their return journey. It was a complex but theoretically sound plan that played to Japanese strengths. Facing them was Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet, a naval armada of unprecedented power. Its centerpiece was Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58, the fast carrier task force, with 15 fleet carriers carrying over 950 aircraft. Spruance, a cautious and cerebral commander, knew the Japanese were coming. The challenge was locating them. American submarines, acting as scouts, had made contact with Ozawa's fleet, providing crucial intelligence. As the Japanese fleet steamed eastward, Spruance positioned Task Force 58 to the west of the Marianas, ready to meet the threat. His primary mission, as assigned by his superior Admiral Nimitz, was to protect the Saipan invasion force. This defensive mindset would lead Spruance to make a controversial decision not to steam west to attack the Japanese carriers at the earliest opportunity, a decision that would be debated for decades. He chose instead to wait, to let the Japanese come to him, ensuring he could destroy their naval air power while still remaining in a position to shield the vulnerable amphibious ships. It was in this context that the escort carriers of Task Group 77.4 operated. They were part of the force that Spruance was protecting. They were, in the grand scheme of the impending battle, the bait. The main event, the clash between Mitcher's fleet carriers and Ozawa's, would become famous as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. On June 19th, the Japanese launched 4 massive raids. American advantages in radar, fighter direction, and pilot training turned the battle into a slaughter. Hellcat fighters, vectored to their targets by ship-based controllers with an eagle's eye view of the airspace, tore into the Japanese formations. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down for the loss of about 30 American planes. The same day, American submarines torpedoed and sank two of Japan's largest carriers, the Shokaku and the brand-new Taiho. The Japanese plan was shattered. Ozawa's naval air arm was effectively destroyed as a fighting force, and all the while the jeep carriers continued their patrols, their own battles fought in a lower register, but with no less consequence for the overall campaign. Launching and recovering aircraft from the deck of an escort carrier was a controlled form of chaos, a triumph of human skill and procedure over a fundamentally hostile environment. The flight deck of a Casablanca-class carrier was only 477 feet long, nearly 400 feet shorter than that of an Essex class. There was no margin for error. For the pilots of the composite squadrons, every takeoff and every landing was a test of nerve. Takeoffs were often assisted by a hydraulic catapult, which shot a fully loaded TBM Avenger, weighing over 8 tons, into the air in less than 2 seconds. The acceleration was violent, pinning the pilot to his seat. Once airborne, the aircraft would struggle for altitude, its engines straining under the load of fuel, depth charges, or bombs. Landings were even more perilous. A pilot returning from a multi-hour patrol, often fatigued and stressed, had to align his aircraft perfectly with a moving, pitching, rolling strip of steel just 80 feet wide. He placed his trust in the landing signal officer, or LSO, a man who stood on a small platform at the stern of the ship, using handheld paddles to communicate minute corrections. A little more throttle, drop a wing, come left. The LSO's judgment was the final word between a safe recovery and a fatal crash. The deck crews, clad in colored jerseys to denote their specific roles, yellow for aircraft directors, blue for plane handlers, red for ordnance men, functioned as a high-performance team. They had to move aircraft, fuel them, arm them, and spot them for launch with incredible speed and precision on a cramped, crowded deck where one mistake could be catastrophic. An errant propeller could kill a man instantly. A loose bomb could spell disaster for the entire ship. Yet these crews, composed largely of young reservists and draftees, maintained a remarkable operational tempo. They had to. The demand for sorties was relentless. Anti-submarine patrols launched at dawn and continued until dusk. Combat air patrols had to be constantly rotated to keep fresh fighters overhead. Ground attack missions were called in by controllers on Saipan at a moment's notice. The crews and pilots improvised constantly. Engine maintenance was performed on the open deck in punishing tropical heat. Damaged aircraft were patched up with whatever materials were at hand. They learned to work with the ship's limitations, using its slow speed and the prevailing winds to their advantage. A hard turn into the wind by the captain could provide a few extra knots of wind speed over the deck, just enough to get a heavily loaded Avenger airborne. This relentless activity, this constant cycle of launch and recovery, was the heart of the escort carrier's contribution. They were not elegant weapons, but they were persistent. They kept air power in the sky, hour after hour, day after day. It was this persistence that wore down the enemy in ways that did not always show up in the dramatic tallies of a single day's battle. They were applying pressure, closing off options, and slowly, methodically eliminating threats. The most immediate and insidious of those threats lurked beneath the waves. Japanese submarine doctrine was predicated on attrition, and the waters around the Marianas were a designated hunting ground. At least a dozen Japanese submarines were known to be operating in the area in mid-June, with orders to sink the high-value American carriers. The task of neutralizing this threat fell primarily to the aircraft of the escort carriers and the surface ships of their screens. The TBM Avenger was the ideal tool for this work. It was a rugged, dependable aircraft with a long endurance, allowing it to patrol for hours. Its belly could carry a 2,000-pound payload, which, for anti-submarine missions, meant a load of 4 350-pound depth charges. Most importantly, many were equipped with the ASV-1 search radar, a primitive but effective system whose antennas gave the Avenger its characteristic Yagi array under each wing. A typical anti-submarine patrol involved a lone Avenger flying a precise search pattern, often a square search, hundreds of miles from its home carrier. The three-man crew, pilot, turret gunner, and radio man, bombardier, would scan the ocean for hours. The work was monotonous and mentally taxing. The radar operator stared at the green glow of his scope, looking for the telltale blip of a surface contact. On June 19th, an Avenger from the USS Midway, CVE-63, part of Taffy 2, was on just such a patrol. The pilot, Lieutenant Junior Grade FC. Fessenden and his crew were scanning a sector to the southwest of Saipan. A contact appeared on the radar. Fessenden descended through the scattered clouds to investigate. He spotted it, the long, dark shape of a Japanese submarine, the RO-114, running on the surface to charge its batteries. The submarine's lookouts saw the Avenger at the same time, and the vessel began a crash dive. Fessenden had only seconds. He pushed the Avenger into a steep dive, aligning his bomb sight on the swirl of water where the submarine was disappearing. He released his depth charges, which were set to explode at a shallow depth. They detonated in a perfect straddle around the submerging vessel. A violent underwater concussion shook the Avenger. A huge plume of black oil, air bubbles, and debris erupted on the surface, a clear sign of a kill. This scene was repeated across the operational area. Avengers from the USS Solomons and other CVES prosecuted contacts, working in concert with the destroyer escorts of the screen. Sometimes the contact was a false one, a whale or a piece of debris, but often it was real. Post-war analysis of Japanese records confirmed that at least 5 Japanese submarines were sunk by American air and surface forces in the vicinity of the Marianas during this period. Each submarine sunk was a major victory. It represented the removal of a weapon that could have potentially sunk a fleet carrier or a transport ship loaded with thousands of troops. The CVESASW patrols created a protective sanctuary around the American fleet. They were a constant, lethal threat that forced Japanese submarine commanders to be cautious, to stay deep, and to limit their time on the surface, dramatically reducing their operational effectiveness. This unseen underwater battle was a critical component of the American victory in the Philippine Sea. It ensured that the fast carriers of Task Force 58 could operate without having to constantly look over their shoulders for torpedo wakes. The jeep carriers were the fleet's guardians, and their work was lethally effective. While the anti-submarine patrols provided a defensive shield, the escort carriers also possessed a significant offensive capability, one aimed squarely at the sinews of the Japanese war machine, its logistical network. Japan's empire was a maritime one, a collection of island garrisons connected by a tenuous lifeline of merchant shipping. Every bullet, every bag of rice, every drum of fuel had to be transported by sea. The American strategy of island hopping was designed to sever these lifelines, to isolate Japanese garrisons, and leave them to wither on the vine. The escort carriers were a perfect instrument for this kind of attritional warfare. Their Avengers could be armed with 500-pound general-purpose bombs, and their Wildcats could strafe unarmored deck targets. While Task Force 58 was engaged with the main Japanese fleet, the CVES of Task Group 77.4 turned their attention to secondary targets of opportunity, particularly the Japanese-held islands of Guam and Rota, which Ozawa had intended to use as refueling stops for his aircraft. Small strike packages, typically composed of 4 to 6 Avengers escorted by a similar number of Wildcats, were launched from the jeep carriers' decks. Their targets were not grand warships, but the humble and vital components of military infrastructure. They bombed airstrips, cratering the runways to make them unusable. They strafed barracks and fuel depots, setting off secondary explosions that sent columns of black smoke billowing into the sky. And they hunted for shipping. Any Japanese vessel found in the waters around the islands was a target. This included small coastal freighters, inter-island transports, and even powered barges. On June 20th and 21st, as the main battle moved westward, strikes from the escort carriers systematically dismantled the remaining Japanese air power and logistical support in the immediate Marianas area. A flight of aircraft from the USS Sangamon discovered a small convoy of Japanese merchant ships, or maris, attempting to flee the area. The Avengers rolled into their bombing runs, releasing their payloads with practiced accuracy. The Wildcats followed, their 6.50 caliber machine guns ripping into the ship's superstructures. Within minutes, the convoy was a collection of burning, sinking wrecks. This was not the decisive, glorious combat of a fleet engagement. It was methodical, brutal, and essential work. Every ship sunk meant a Japanese garrison would be weaker. It meant fewer supplies, less ammunition, and less food for the soldiers who would soon be facing American Marines. The strikes also served to suppress any remaining Japanese aircraft on Guam and Rota, preventing them from launching nuisance raids against the American fleet. The constant harassment from the CVES aircraft ensured that these islands, which were meant to be a source of strength for Ozawa's fleet, instead became a liability, their airfields rendered useless and their garrisons isolated. The escort carriers were, in effect, conducting a siege by air, extending American control over not just the sea, but the entire operational environment. The cumulative effect of these small-scale actions was a significant degradation of Japan's ability to resist the American advance. The Imperial Japanese Navy's war planners, products of a rigid and hierarchical system, were doctrinally focused on the singular, decisive battle. Their entire strategy, from ship design to pilot training, was geared towards a single, climactic clash of capital ships, a modern-day Tsushima. In their operational calculus for Operation A-Go, the American fast carriers of Task Force 58 were the center of gravity. Sinking the Essex-class and Independence-class carriers was the primary objective. Everything else was secondary. The small, slow escort carriers were noted by Japanese intelligence, but they were largely dismissed. They were considered a defensive force, a component of the amphibious screen, not a significant offensive threat. Their aircraft were fewer in number, and their performance, particularly that of the FM-2 Wildcat, was considered inferior to Japan's latest fighters. This was a classic case of doctrinal blindness, an inability to see the war as it was actually being fought. Japanese commanders like Admiral Ozawa failed to appreciate the synergistic nature of American naval power. They saw the jeep carriers as individual, weak units, not as integral parts of a complex, layered system of defense and offense. They did not fully grasp the strategic impact of the CVES anti-submarine operations. Their own submarine commanders, who were being systematically hunted and destroyed by CVE aircraft and screening destroyers, sent back frantic but incomplete reports. The full picture of a coordinated, relentless anti-submarine warfare campaign never coalesced at the fleet command level. The result was that the Japanese submarine force, which was supposed to be a key component of the AGO plan, was largely neutralized before it could make a significant impact. Likewise, the offensive potential of the CVES against logistical targets was underestimated. The Japanese viewed the war in terms of major combatants. The loss of a few small transports or the cratering of an auxiliary airfield on Guam seemed insignificant compared to the goal of sinking an American fleet carrier. They failed to understand that the American war effort was a vast industrial enterprise, and that this enterprise was now being used to systematically dismantle their own. The CVES were a direct expression of this industrial approach to warfare. They were a mass-produced tool designed for attritional tasks. The Japanese miscalculation was to see the tool but not the system behind it. They saw a slow, vulnerable ship, not a mobile airbase that could project power persistently over a wide area, strangling supply lines and blinding reconnaissance efforts. This underestimation would have profound consequences. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, it meant that the CVES were largely left alone to do their vital work. A few months later, in October 1944 at the Battle off Samar, this same miscalculation would lead a powerful Japanese surface force of battleships and cruisers to be completely surprised and ultimately thwarted by a small group of these same escort carriers and their screening ships in one of the most famous naval actions in history. The seeds of that future Japanese failure were sown here, in the Marianas, in the fundamental misunderstanding of what these unassuming little carriers represented. The actions of the escort carriers, though seemingly peripheral, had a direct and significant impact on the outcome of the larger battle. By relentlessly hunting Japanese submarines, the CVES created a sanitized operational area for the American fleet. This had two major effects. First, it protected the hundreds of vulnerable amphibious ships, troop transports, and supply vessels anchored off Saipan, which would have been prime targets for any submarine that broke through the screen. Second, and more critically, it gave Admiral Mitcher's task force 58 freedom of maneuver. Without a constant, pervasive submarine threat to worry about, Mitcher's fast carriers could focus entirely on the air battle and on finding and sinking Ozawa's fleet. The CVES effectively absorbed the crucial but unglamorous task of underwater defense, allowing the fleet carriers to concentrate their overwhelming offensive power. The strikes against Guam and Rota were equally important. By neutralizing the airfields on these islands, the escort carriers eliminated what was supposed to be a key Japanese advantage. Ozawa's plan for shuttle bombing, relying on these fields for refueling, was rendered impossible. Japanese planes that were damaged or low on fuel had nowhere safe to land. This strategic denial of territory turned the islands from assets into traps for the Japanese. The cumulative result of these actions was an expansion of American striking power and a reinforcement of its dominance over the entire theater of operations. The CVES acted as a force multiplier. They extended the reach of American naval aviation, ensuring that no sector was left uncovered. While the Hellcats of Task Force 58 were winning the massive air battle hundreds of miles to the west, the Wildcats and Avengers of the Jeep carriers were securing the rear, suppressing local threats, and cutting enemy supply lines. This created a seamless web of control over the sea and the air. The Japanese fleet faced a multi-layered, omnidirectional threat. There were no safe corridors, no quiet sectors. The pressure was constant. After the turkey shoot of June 19th, when Spruance finally unleashed Task Force 58 to chase the retreating Japanese fleet on June 20th, the CVES remained on station, maintaining the security of the Saipan beachhead. They continued to fly their patrols, a steadfast, reliable presence that guaranteed the integrity of the entire American operation. The jeep carriers had demonstrated that they were more than just convoy escorts. They were versatile platforms capable of performing a wide range of essential combat missions, relieving the pressure on the high-value fleet carriers and contributing directly to the strategic victory. Their performance in the Philippine Sea validated the concept of the escort carrier as an indispensable component of the modern naval fleet. In the final accounting of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the escort carriers did not claim the stunning victory tallies of the fast carriers. They did not sink battleships or shoot down hundreds of aircraft in a single day. Their contribution was measured differently, in submarines that never reached their targets, in convoys that never made port, in Japanese garrisons that were a little weaker, a little more isolated. The jeep carriers, once dismissed as slow, vulnerable stopgaps, had proven themselves to be indispensable. They were the embodiment of a new kind of naval warfare, one where industrial mass production and operational flexibility could overcome doctrinal rigidity. The crews of ships like the USS Fanshawe Bay and USS Midway had demonstrated that the effectiveness of a weapon system depended as much on the skill and determination of the men who operated it as on its design specifications. They had maintained a high sortie rate from tiny, unstable flight decks, proving that persistence could be as potent as raw power. The battle had been a catastrophic defeat for the Imperial Japanese Navy, a blow from which its naval air arm would never recover. The American fleet had established an unassailable dominance over the Central Pacific. The escort carriers had played a crucial, if often overlooked, role in securing that dominance. Their performance in June 1944 was a prelude to their finest and most desperate hour. 4 months later, at the battle off Samar, 3 of the task units that fought in the Philippine Sea, Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3, would find themselves standing alone against the main body of the Japanese fleet, including the super battleship Yamato. They would be forced to fight a battle for which they were never designed, and their incredible courage in that fight would become the stuff of naval legend. But it was here, in the vast contested waters of the Philippine Sea, that they first proved their full worth on the grand strategic stage. The escort carrier, born of desperation and built on a merchant hull, had become a vital tool of oceanic conquest, ensuring there was no gap in the relentless and total application of American sea power.